So, I believe this is recording. This video then is to introduce you to Football for Peace, not so much as an organization of what we do in terms of that sort of thing, but more specifically about the challenges an organization like Football for Peace attempts to address, the challenges it faces in attempting to address those existing external challenges, and also what the new challenges are that Football for Peace faces as an organization. And that's where you guys can then come in and help. Allow me to introduce myself a little bit. My name's Tom Carter. Most people call me Tom, which is fine. And I'm currently the director of Football for Peace. You'll learn more about Football for Peace, its history, and that sort of thing over the next few weeks of this course. The URL that's on this particular slide starting this is our website that has much more detail about who we are, about our history, about the places we work, and about some of the research that has been done because of the work of Football for Peace as well. And this is just basically then to serve as an introduction for you to get to grips with what this course is about and what you're going to be asked to do as a project in helping Football for Peace here for this course. With that in mind, originally, when this course was designed, we would have been in Belfast, Northern Ireland last week, around Easter time, just after Easter, possibly right before. But if I don't know if it's made the news where you are or not, but in recent times, in the last 10 nights, this has been the scenes in Belfast. There has been rioting with youths throwing petrol bombs and rocks at police using water cannons, people's cars being hijacked and then burnt, and fires put in dumpster and skips and rolled at police lines. There has been basically nights of violence in various parts of the city. If we had actually been there at that time, one of the flashpoints, which is the points where youths and police meet, where lines are set up, would actually have been within less than half a mile from where we would have been staying. So while you're studying sport for development and you're learning about sport for development and peace over this period of course, if we'd been able to run this course the way we had originally designed it, this would have been some very intensive experiential learning. And unfortunately, we aren't able to do that because of the pandemic and what have you. So instead, we're going to have to provide it in some other way. And hopefully this video begins to provide some introduction, some ways of you learning. Now, I mentioned this, and I draw your attention to Belfast in Northern Ireland because it's one of the places Football for Peace works. Because of the violence that's been happening there now, and how that could have affected us if we had been there, but also because, quite simply, Northern Ireland is sort of where some of the ideas for Football for Peace began, and it has to do with the history of Northern Ireland. So before there was Football for Peace, right? Before there was Football for Peace, and so we're talking before 2001, the violence in Northern Ireland had been ongoing for about 50 years in something that's called the Troubles. Since the 1960s, early 1970s, particularly 1972 with the British Army shooting a number of protesters in Derry in 1972 on what's called Bloody Sunday. The Troubles have been around for a long time. And the Troubles are essentially systemic violence done by paramilitary organizations, done by government organizations, against their own populations and against what they see as the other community. And this violence is based on a number of different divides in that community, such that most aspects of life in Northern Ireland are segregated. So one of the major ways that the segregation happens is through education. There are separate schooling systems and separate schools for those who are Protestant, for those who are Catholic. So Northern Ireland is a Christian country divided by Protestant and Catholics. It's also divided ethnically and politically between those who identify themselves as British and Unionist, meaning wanting to remain as part of the United Kingdom, and those who identify themselves as Irish and wanting Northern Ireland to be unified with the Republic of Ireland into one whole, the whole island being one country. This history then goes back to the days of the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, into the 20th century, of course. And education then is separate. So you have Catholic schools and Protestant schools. You have communities, neighborhoods that are all Protestant or all Catholic. You have rural towns that are one or the other, or virtually all one or the other. Belfast, being the capital of Northern Ireland, being a major city, then has neighborhoods in which one neighborhood will be all Catholic or Republican, another neighborhood will be all Protestant or Unionist, and there are certain points in the city then where the roads these might meet up against one another, and walls have been built. They're called peace walls to separate the communities, to prevent violence. During the Troubles, it wasn't just education and spatial separation into communities. There was segregation in all walks of life. So you had to know which taxi companies would serve which communities to be able to take a taxi safely from the city center to where you wanted to go. Different shops served different communities. Different sports and sporting clubs then also depended on the community. If you grew up in one of the neighborhoods that was Protestant and you went to a Protestant school, you then would be taught as a child to play football, okay, rugby, netball if you were a girl, hockey, boys or girls. And basically you would be taught what were seen and labeled as British sports. If you went to a Catholic school, right, your sports clubs would revolve around Irish games, the Gaelic games like hurling, Gaelic football, but also basketball and football on a grassroots level. The elite level of football is controlled by and remains under the control of more unionist elements. So much so that if you were a young man, and this is before women's football really took off, so young man becoming highly skilled and elite at playing football in Northern Ireland, and you were Catholic, if you were selected for the Northern Ireland team, elements of the society would attempt to frighten you away, would threaten you with bodily harm, would threaten your family with bodily harm, would threaten to burn your house down, would threaten to do all sorts of things to drive you out. Such that a number of elite footballers who could have represented their own country, Northern Ireland, elected to represent the Republic of Ireland or another country. They were driven out. Professional football in Northern Ireland is wholly Protestant. All the clubs have Protestant histories. There were Catholic clubs. They were driven out in the 1970s and 80s. They were destroyed, basically. I mention this because the one sport where the overlap happens in the education system or in those things is football. Despite the disparities in control and power as an institutional structure, football is one of the commonalities that crosses in terms of social activity. In the 1990s, a scholar, professor at University of Ulster, who was from England, looked at all this and said, right, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And in talking with a lot of his students and all that, decided to form a particular project that was called Belfast United, form a football club in which essentially grassroots, middling level potential, athletes with potential even, footballers from both communities would come together to form a club, a cross-community club. It was the first of its kind. Belfast United then began to play in higher level grassroots leagues, but they also worked on addressing the community divide, trying to form a way to demonstrate that coexistence could happen and that sport was a particularly good tool for that. The young men that were involved with this also then would got the opportunities to go to the United States and travel and play football against American community clubs and that sort of thing, American universities. And it was a small seed that had the potential to grow into something larger. The Troubles officially came to an end in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Paramilitaries agreed to put away their weapons. The British Army agreed to scale down its existence and leave. The police agreed to certain things, and this agreement was signed and agreed to both by the paramilitary organizations on both sides, but also by the Irish government and the British government. Because the Northern Ireland conflict and the Troubles is not just about Northern Ireland, it's about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And well, that becomes important a little later on. But basically that history then of Northern Ireland and that violence has not left, as you can see with the violence that has been ongoing for the past 2 weeks in Belfast with the photos I just mentioned. With all of that, and that violence, that's indicative of the violence has continued. Officially, Northern Ireland is at peace. In practice, is very much a divided country. The communities are very much divided. And while the systemic violence is gone, there is still considerable amounts of violence within the country that can rapidly become much more organized violence, like that rioting there. Those youths are not just rioting because they're looking for an evening's fun. They are rioting at the direction of certain community leaders. Football for Peace began in August of 2001. And it began after the scholar who left, Professor Sugden, who left University of Ulster in 2000 and came, or 1999, and came to the University of Brighton and in Southeast England. And upon his arrival here, fairly quickly, within a year or so, a couple of years, talking to one of his colleagues at the university, but also with an Anglican priest by the name of Geoffrey White, they saw the potential for using football based on Professor Sugden's experience with Belfast United to attempt to run a similar sort of project in Israel with the idea of bringing together Arab and Jewish children from divided communities to get them to begin to educate them and shift their lenses of the ways they saw the world, so that instead of seeing someone as an other, as someone dehumanized, or as something even less than human, to begin to see them as actual people. And in these early days and in these beginnings, then working in Israel, they didn't work in the major cities. They went and worked in a couple of places between Haifa and Nazareth, in which they would bring together the children from a Jewish community and an Arab community, in which the children and even the adults in these communities had never been to the other community, even though they might only be 3 kilometers apart. They had certainly never been in the homes of the opposing ethnic group. And so bringing the children together and then mixing them into clubs to train together and to play for a week or two, just a start, already you began to see the shifts in attitudes of the children towards the children from the other ethnic group. Whereas at the beginning of the week, you might see something where it was that Jew or that Arab. It became, oh, well, so-and-so's actually pretty good. Ahmed's a good striker. Osha is a good goalkeeper. And they began to refer to each other by names, and then they actually began to become teammates and friends. So it was building this idea of community and building this idea of coexistence throughout. And those beginnings were fairly modest. So it was a group of about 6 or 7 people in the initial camp, initial project. That grew fairly rapidly, and it grew fairly rapidly in terms of what they were doing. And in terms of what they're doing, what we now provide, and what we initially attempted to provide, were the things that were on the left-hand column here, under the Rugby for Peace and Football for Peace logos. What they were attempting to provide was a dedicated program for education and conflict resolution. That has evolved over the last 20 years into dedicated programs around education, peace education in particular, around capacity building and social development for local communities, around conflict resolution and reconciliation programs in those communities that are designed and run by people in those communities using different sports, depending on where in the world we are. Football was chosen initially because, of course, it's universal. The issue is football can be very political in many countries. So even in Northern Ireland, as I outlined before, right, if the institutions of football are controlled by one particular group, that excludes other and marginalizes other groups, which makes it awfully hard for coexistence to happen. So sometimes we had to use other sports. Rugby has been one that we've introduced in a number of sports that we've introduced in a couple of different countries more recently, simply because of that. Second thing Football for Peace does and provides is coach education. We have our own methodology for training coaches. We don't train coaches to develop sports skills. If we're talking about football, FIFA has a whole big program about that, right? UEFA has coach education programs. There's different levels of coaching you can get. That's not what we're talking about in terms of coach education. What we're talking about is a methodology that doesn't develop the sporting skill, but rather develops the whole person holistically. Social skills, interpersonal skills, through the use of sport. We also do this with higher education curriculum. So we provide material and we use this methodology in teaching at universities. Both here, Germany, it's been done. It's been done in a couple other places as well. And then also initial teacher training. Football for Peace works quite closely with the University of Brighton. The University of Brighton has a very large and significant physical education program for teacher training. And the methodology the staff there have incorporated Football for Peace's methodology into their own methodology and pedagogy for what they teach to train physical education teachers. So that was the initial bit. What we also provide and get involved with are social justice and human rights campaigns. One in particular in England here is something called Football for Peace versus Homophobia. Worked closely with something called the Justin Campaign. The Justin Campaign fights homophobia. And the Justin Campaign exists and is named for Justin Fashanu. Justin Fashanu was a professional footballer who killed himself after coming out as being homosexual whilst a player, because of the abuse and everything that he got. And so the campaign started to fight that homophobia and fight that sorts of things. The last thing that we've done and provided then has also been using our methodology and that sort of thing, a program that helps individuals with special education needs and disabilities by providing them with a holiday, in effect, an opportunity to leave home and come to the English seaside, to the coast, to have a week-long or so holiday with curriculum, come with their carers or with the long-term carers or with their parents, and also with any sort of mentoring support, maybe some social workers, to help give them a new environment and learn some new ways of possibly coexisting and working with relationships and that sort of thing. So we do a variety of things, but the main things that we do are actually the first bits that I talked about. From starting in Israel, then, we work in lots of different places around the world currently, right? We started in Israel in 2001. We stopped working in Israel in 2011, 2012. We are now returning to Israel at the request of the Israeli Sports Authority, more for an evaluative situation because we had built the capacity there such that we were no longer needed, but now they want us to come back and evaluate what they've been doing. But in the early years of working in Israel, then opportunities also came to work in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories, and also across the border in Jordan. And that work went on in the early 2000s. Also worked in Germany, working with a German university as a partner there as well, in developing Football for Peace, some of the staff there, and training some of them in the values-based methodology. And some of those German trained coaches then went and worked in the Middle East as well. And also came into work in Northern Ireland and worked with the Northern Ireland Irish project across the border there. And borders are very important. Borders are very important because borders are mechanisms for dividing people. And the borders that we've been talking about here between Israel and the Palestinian territories, Israel and Jordan, between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, are political boundaries. And in many cases, these boundaries are enforced through military might, through the use of systemic violence, and they set up divided communities or the potential for divided communities. It's not true in every single situation, but that's the underlying principle of where we work. We worked in places where there are borders that divide people. Those borders may not be political. Those borders may also be social, economic. Those can be certainly related to political borders as well. In the 2000s, then we also began working in South Africa, particularly around physical education and working with teacher training there. South Korea, we began working on and working with partners there as well. That's another country, another situation where there's a hard political border that is maintained through military and systemic violence, or the threat of, that then also divides the people ethnically, divides people socially, economically, and what have you. Excuse me. Yes, we work at, obviously we work in England through teacher training, through the programs such as the Justin Campaign and so forth. More recently, we started working in the Gambia. The Gambia is an interesting case, separate from the earlier cases because there was no history. There is no military border. There's no militarized border. There's no history of political conflict in the country to speak of. And it appeared there would be no real reason for us to be there, except that we came at the invitation of an organization there to help train an environmental group, of all things, with our methodology around values and that sort of thing. But what emerged very quickly was that there were other kinds of borders in effect. There was high levels of ethnic tension and ethnic conflict. There are gender disparities that need to be addressed, and that became one of the things we addressed there, and that sort of in terms of the Gambia. And so that became much more of the project that we worked there. And then most recently we began to work in Colombia. Again, Colombia it's not a question of the borders around Colombia as it has been the paramilitary systemic violence in the country that has had a civil war going on there for a number of years between a number of different guerrilla groups, the Colombian government, and the narco industries, which has resulted in systemic violence, both in the cities, but also towards certain groups like indigenous groups, Afro-Colombian groups, and led to the marginalization of major sections of the country. And so we also went there to work with an NGO based in Colombia, a Colombian organization, at their invitation to help them. So we work in a variety of places around the world, is what I'm getting at. There are challenges, right? Our challenges then in those different places are both practical and in terms of what we do. Our challenges are both in terms of what our practices are, but also our goals. So in practice, what we're trying to do is impact communities by creating an adaptable model and making our training sustainable. Those are our challenges as an organization that we've had in working in those places, right? And that means one of the big challenges we've had in practice is capacity building, training enough people who then can train others so that we are no longer needed. And we do this through sharing good practice. That's been one of the challenges, is we're coming at the invitation of other organizations. And so changing the perception that we're the experts that know everything. And so it's learning what other organizations already do and do well, that we can learn from them as much as we are helping them. And in that regard, we're creating sustainable partnerships. We're creating partnerships that are based more on equality and equity than they are on a client relationship. In practice, then we also end up influencing policies, both at local levels. So it might be a local mayor or something of that sort, but it also can be at the national level. So for example, our work in South Africa in working with teacher training and physical education and using our particular values-based methodology has been recognized and used to the point that it is now influencing and being written into the national government's policy on physical education curriculum. And lastly, part of our practice is cultural exchange, of having not just English people going to these various places, but people who are working in the partners who have also been trained by Football4Peace, going to other places where there are projects for Football4Peace and working there. So we've had Koreans working in Gambia. We have had Germans working in Northern Ireland, as I mentioned before, and so forth. And we do all these different practices of impacting communities, creating adaptable models, trying to build capacity, sharing good practice to try and meet certain goals. The overarching goal is to build peace. But we can't create that peace. We know that. So all we try to do is create the environment where some things might happen. Our goal then is to provide education, to provide new ways or alternative ways of doing things, of thinking about things, of communicating and so forth, of trying to, and then also part of that goal is trying to address women's empowerment. Right? Trying to address the inequities, the inequalities in society that create conflict. Because what we're really trying to do as our goals is reduce conflict, resolve conflict in places where it exists, or prevent it and the violence that comes with it in those places where it doesn't exist yet. More recently, then, particularly working in Colombia and the Gambia, then it has also become along the lines of goals of protecting the environment a bit more. Now, that can be the social environment, but that can also mean the natural environment. And it's helping by addressing the divides in communities that generate conflict and sustain conflict which can be arguments over resources, for example. It's helping those communities both decide for themselves how and what their surroundings should be like and what the environment should be like, but also how to protect themselves and their local environments from external threats. And then all of this done, we try to do our goals by building cross-community dialogue, by building cross situations and spaces where people with very different views in these divided communities can come together and actually treat one another with respect and trust and communicate. In the past, those are what we try to do as an organ. In the past, what we try to do, and then those goals are what we attempt to achieve. Those are our challenges that we attempt to achieve. But we also have challenges as an organization. Some of those are strategic. Where should we go next? Should we continue working in these places? Those kinds of questions. Some of them are structural. Football4Peace has worked closely with the University of Brighton. It's been influenced by the University of Brighton for a number of reasons. The structural sorts of things make it unusual in that regard. So we also have had some challenges in that regard. Football4Peace is also 100% volunteers, so including myself. So that means that has an impact on the kinds of structures that we have in place and how we work as an organization. It also means we have some financial challenges. It's 100% volunteers. Where are we getting the money from to actually do this? How do we get the money to run these projects? Football4Peace has an unusual funding model that is both precarious and somewhat successful. And so, but it sets up a number of other challenges that are strategic and structural because of that. And I'm happy to talk to you guys more about that. There are logistical challenges of just trying to run a program in a new country or trying to maintain a program in a country. Whether those logistical questions are around communication, around transport, around anything else about moving equipment, whatever it happens to be. And then past challenges have also been sustainable questions. How do we keep Football4Peace as an organization sustainable? How do we keep each project sustainable? Should we keep each project sustainable? Those have been the kinds of challenges we've had in the past. Those challenges have been directly influenced by the events in the past 12 months, 13 months now. In effect, the pandemic. The pandemic has, and as you will learn in this course, the pandemic has had a massive impact on sport for development overall, international development in general. The current context for Football4Peace, with that background around the organization then, has been the restrictions on international travel have meant that all of our partnerships in which volunteers would travel from one country to another to work have stopped. You can't go anywhere. So that's become a particular challenge. Second one is with our values-based methodology, and as you'll see in some of the videos on the course around that some of the coaches have produced for you to try and see the kinds of activities we do, social distancing is an issue. How do you actually build trust and through physical exercise, through playing sport, when you have to maintain 2 meters distance? A third current context with Football4Peace, right now, one of our challenges is the loss of volunteers. Many of our volunteers are university students. They volunteer while they're at university because they have that extra time. When they graduate and start their careers and they start their families, that takes up all their time. They don't have time to commit to Football4Peace. Perfectly understandable. But while we haven't been able to do activities, students have still graduated. That has led to the interruption of services, not just of Football4Peace in England and the volunteers in England going overseas, or people from other places overseas going to other projects or coming to England, but local organizations themselves all around the world having to shut down through lockdowns, not being able to run their programs or not being able to get enough people to run their programs. So the interruption of services, not just for us, but through a whole, if you will, network has been the current context. It's also then an interruption of the training program. I just mentioned that university students continue to graduate. Well, Football for Peace, one of the ways it's maintained its volunteer status and the way it works is by affiliating with the university. Is university students coming in get the opportunity to add to their university education by volunteering and working with Football for Peace and learning even more. And they do that. But of course, after 3 or 4 years, they graduate and move on. And so then we're continually in a process of losing volunteers, but also recruiting volunteers. With the pandemic, with the lockdowns, with the inability to augment or deal with social distancing in that way, we've had an interruption of the training programs and therefore and also an interruption of our recruitment. The best spokespeople we have for our programs in England are the university students in their 3rd and 4th years, because they've had some of that experience and they sell, they talk about it so much and so glowingly that they sell it to the 1st-year students coming in, and then they want to get involved. But when we lose those to graduates, we don't have that voice anymore. And then also we've lost funding and revenue and funding streams because of the nature of the way Football for Peace is organized financially. And we can talk more about that. And then lastly, this is the challenge then, the new challenge, the challenges that the organization faces, but then also the challenge I'm setting for you guys. What I would like is to have you guys then sit down and come up with a strategic plan of how Football for Peace should move forward. How should we survive as an organization? The pandemic is forcing changes. I just outlined some of the changes that have been forced upon Football for Peace because of the pandemic. The likelihood is we can't go back to that, because that's true for all aspects of life. So how should football survive? Football for Peace survive? What are the organizational changes that we need to make? How should these be accomplished? What practices should change? And in terms of practices, that could be how we deliver projects, how we create partnerships, how we do all these other things, right? So it could be any of these things. I'm happy to answer more questions, have long talks with you guys about Football for Peace, about what we've done in the past, about how these things work. I encourage you to go on the website and read all of that. There's some videos on the website as well that would be quite useful for information, more information for you. We will be working together over the next few weeks, which is fine, and I'll do what I can. I'm happy to work with you guys as we need to answer questions and all that. We'll set up some times to do that. I hope you didn't find this too boring or too boring. We'll leave it at that. And that you are looking forward to what we're doing over the next few weeks.